At 11:08 p.m. local time last night, the cruiser USS Lake Erie, call sign Lakefire Actual, was running a standard Aegis air defense patrol 41 miles west-northwest of Scarborough Shoal when the SPY-1B radar picked up something that had no business being there. 8 tracks, supersonic, sea-skimming, inbound, range to impact, under 2 minutes. The Combat Information Center had 47 seconds from first acquisition to engagement solution on all 8 missiles simultaneously. 47 seconds. That is not a typo, and it is not a dramatic flourish. That number comes directly from a declassified after-action excerpt obtained by a 7th Fleet liaison, and it is now the most discussed figure in every naval warfare college on the planet. Here is what makes that number extraordinary. The SM-2 Block 3C, the primary intercept missile in Lakefire Actual's forward magazine, was designed to engage 1, 2, maybe 4 targets in a coordinated salvo. The Aegis combat system was upgraded precisely to handle more. But 8 supersonic anti-ship missiles released simultaneously from 4 H-6K bombers operating in coordinated ripple fire, arriving on compressed time-over-target spacing. That is a scenario the system was built for in theory and had never faced in practice. 6 of those missiles never reached USS Lake Erie. The 7th was killed by a rolling airframe missile at terminal range, close enough that the detonation lit up the afterdeck like a flashbulb. The 8th sea-skimmed past the stern and detonated 190 meters astern, close enough to drive fragment penetration through hull plating on the aftersection. No fatalities. But the Ticonderoga-class cruiser that went into that engagement as a surface combatant came out of it as a data point. And every lesson in that data point is already being absorbed in Norfolk. Before we continue, stop for a second. Lakefire Actual just intercepted 7 of 8 YJ-12B supersonic missiles in 47 seconds, took fragment damage from the 8th, and has an EA-18G Growler package inbound from the George Washington. What do you think happens next? A. The Growlers jam and suppress Subi Reef's air defenses, the strike goes clean, and the PLA stands down. B. The Growlers run into a second Chinese SAM layer that wasn't on the targeting package, and the strike becomes a fight to survive. C. Something else entirely happens at minute 26, and you have to see it to believe it. Drop your call, A, B, or C, in the comments right now. We will be at that answer in about 4 minutes. Let's run the math on how this started. 4 H-6K bombers. That is where this starts. The H-6K is not a new aircraft. It is a Chinese modernization of the Soviet Tu-16 Badger, a design dating to the 1950s. But what the PLA Naval Air Force has done with that airframe over the past decade is the reason it appears in the threat assessment of every carrier strike group commander in the Pacific. The H-6K received a complete engine overhaul. D-30KP, 2 turbofans replacing the original WP-8S, extending combat radius to roughly 3,500 kilometers. Under each wing, it can carry 2 YJ-12B anti-ship missiles. 4 aircraft, 2 missiles each. 8 missiles total. The YJ-12B is a different category of problem from anything the U.S. Navy regularly drilled against through most of the past decade. Range: approximately 400 kilometers in its anti-ship configuration. Speed: Mach 2 to Mach 3 at altitude, transitioning to sea-skimming terminal approach at low supersonic. The terminal phase is where it gets dangerous. The missile drops to between 5 and 10 meters above the water surface, cutting radar acquisition time dramatically, while maintaining enough kinetic energy on impact that even a near miss generates dangerous fragmentation. Its warhead weighs approximately 205 kilograms. Not the largest in the PLA inventory, but more than enough to disable or sink a destroyer-class hull, and more than enough to cause serious structural damage to a cruiser on a direct hit. The 4 H-6Ks operating last night originated from Lingshui Naval Air Station on Hainan Island, roughly 800 kilometers from Scarborough Shoal. They flew south-southeast in a standard patrol formation that U.S. maritime patrol aircraft and satellites track routinely. Nothing in their flight profile before release indicated a coordinated attack. This is one of the pieces of the after-action that is not yet resolved. How 4 bombers transitioned from patrol to coordinated ripple fire without triggering earlier warning. The answer probably involves timing. The bombers would have needed to hit a precise release point simultaneously to compress the time over target spread on 8 missiles to the 47-second engagement window Aegis actually faced. A staggered release, even 90 seconds of spread, would have given USS Lake Erie sequential engagement geometry instead of simultaneous. The compressed simultaneity was the design of the attack. That is not improvised. That is a drilled doctrine. We showed you the YJ-12B's terminal geometry 2 videos ago when we broke down the PLA's carrier-killer kill chain from Hainan. What we did not show you is what a coordinated 8-round ripple release looks like inside the Aegis combat system, because until last night, that scenario existed only in simulation. To understand why that flight profile transition went undetected for as long as it did, you need to understand what U.S. maritime patrol coverage looks like over the western South China Sea at night. The P-8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft operating out of Clark Air Base and Kadena follow routing patterns that prioritize coverage of the northern Spratlys and the approaches to Luzon Strait, the southern corridor. The airspace through which 4 H-6Ks flying from Lingshui would transit on a bearing toward Scarborough Shoal is covered by satellite and long-range radar, but the revisit cadence on that satellite track is not continuous. There are windows. The PLA knows the windows. Mission planning for a coordinated multi-aircraft launch of that kind would account for the surveillance gap and sequence the formation's release point to fall within it. The 4 bombers flew in a formation spacing consistent with a routine long-range maritime patrol sortie. Spacing between aircraft, approximately 2 kilometers lateral, 500 meters vertical, staggered in a patrol spread rather than an attack formation. This is a deliberate deception profile the PLA has practiced publicly in exercises since 2019. The transition to coordinated release geometry, compressing spacing, synchronizing release timing, happens fast and at low altitude relative to the orbital path of the monitoring satellite. What the after-action will likely conclude, once the full intelligence picture is reconstructed, is that the 4 H-6Ks were effectively invisible as an attack formation until the missiles were already in the air. That is the surveillance gap the PLA exploited. And it is a gap they have been systematically studying for at least 6 years. We showed you the YJ-12B's terminal geometry 2 videos ago when we broke down the PLA's carrier-killer kill chain from Hainan. What we did not show you is what a coordinated 8-round ripple release looks like inside the Aegis combat system, because until last night, that scenario existed only in simulation. Here is where the 47-second number becomes a real engineering problem, not just a striking statistic. The Aegis combat system uses the AN/SP-1 phased array radar. On Ticonderoga-class cruisers, the SPY-1B variant, to simultaneously track multiple targets and assign intercept solutions. The system can theoretically engage multiple targets in parallel, but parallel engagement against 8 supersonic inbounds on compressed time-over-target spacing creates a specific magazine and fire control sequencing problem. SM-2 Block 3C. Range: roughly 167 kilometers in anti-air mode. Speed: Mach 3.5. Against a supersonic inbound at sea-skimming altitude, the engagement window opens late and closes fast. Against 8 simultaneous inbounds, the fire control system has to sequence launches so that each SM-2 reaches its intercept point before the target reaches the ship. Firing too early wastes the intercept geometry. Firing too late leaves no time for a second shot. The fire control team on USS Lake Erie engaged 6 of the 8 inbounds with SM-2 in the first 35 seconds. 6 launches, 6 intercepts. The 7th missile got through the SM-2 layer, likely because the fire control sequence had exhausted its immediate intercept geometry on the 6 priority tracks, and the 7th arrived on an angular approach that put it inside SM-2 minimum engagement range before a second shot was possible. That is where the rolling airframe missile took over. The RAM system, RIM-116, is the last-ditch point defense layer on U.S. surface combatants. It is a passive infrared and radio frequency homing missile, 127 kilograms, launched from a 21-round launcher. It does not require radar illumination from the ship. The seeker head finds the inbound's exhaust or radio frequency emissions and guides autonomously. This matters at terminal range because in the final seconds of a supersonic inbounds approach, active radar illumination from the ship becomes geometrically complicated by surface, clutter, and the missile's sea-skimming profile. The ram engaged Missile 7 at a range of roughly 5 kilometers. Terminal detonation. The expanding rod warhead generated a fragmentation cone that destroyed the inbound. Lake-Fire Actual's crew on the afterdeck felt the shock wave. Missile 8 was already past the ram's optimal engagement envelope when the system cycled. It sea-skimmed past the port quarter, detonated 190 meters astern, and the fragmentation from the 205-kilogram warhead drove metal through the hull, plating on the aftersection. Here is what strikes us about that outcome. USS Lake Erie performed exactly as designed. The Aegis system, the SM-2 block thrice key battery, the ram layer, all of them functioned. The intercept rate was 87, 5% against a simultaneous 8-round supersonic salvo at compressed time over target. By any historical standard, that is a remarkable engagement. The U.S. Navy spent 3 decades building a system that could do exactly what Lake-Fire Actual did last night, and one missile still got through. 1 out of 8 is the argument every admiral in the PLA was banking on. Fire enough missiles simultaneously enough times, and the math eventually produces a hit. The cost asymmetry on this engagement is worth running right now, because it tells you more about PLA doctrine than the engagement itself does. 1YJ-12B anti-ship missile, approximately $3 million to $4 million per round, based on known Chinese export pricing for comparable systems. 8 rounds, roughly $24 million to $32 million worth of ordnance. 1 SM-2 block thrice C, approximately $2, $1 million per round. 6 SM-2 intercepts, $12, $6 million. 1 RAM intercept, approximately $400,000. Total U.S. intercept cost, roughly $13 million. Total PLA strike cost, roughly $28 million, using the midpoint. The PLA spent more on this strike than the U.S. Navy spent to defeat it. That seems like a U.S. win. And in the narrow tactical frame of last night's engagement, it was. But the strategic math runs differently. The PLA absorbed a $28 million expenditure and put fragment penetration through the hull of a Ticonderoga-class cruiser. That cruiser is now heading to a repair facility. Its Aegis combat system is offline during transit. Its combat power is subtracted from the 7th Fleet Order of Battle for however long the repair takes. The PLA got a degraded U.S. cruiser for $28 million. How much does a Ticonderoga-class cruiser cost to build? Approximately $1, $5 billion. The last of the class was commissioned in 1994. There is no replacement in production. That is the equation Iran figured out 3 years ago in the Red Sea, and the PLA Naval Air Force has clearly been studying. You do not have to sink the ship. You just have to make the math work in your favor over enough engagements. What happened in the immediate minutes after the 8th missile detonated astern of USS Lake Erie is worth walking through in detail, because it tells you something about the crew that is separate from the technology story. The after-action timeline reconstructed from the ship's logs and crew statements shows that the damage control response was initiated within 90 seconds of Missile 8's detonation. Chief Damage Control Technician Marcus Webb, a 15-year Navy veteran who had been through 2 previous deployment cycles with Lake-Fire Actual, led the after-section response team through smoke and debris on the port quarter deck. The hull penetrations from the fragmentation cone were assessed at 3 distinct entry points along a roughly 4-meter section of plating below the waterline. Flooding was minimal. The penetrations were above the current waterline by approximately 60 centimeters at the ship's loaded draft. But the structural integrity of the plating in that section was compromised, and any increase in sea state or speed-induced dynamic loading would change that calculation. Webb's team had hydraulic patching equipment deployed and initial plugs placed within 11 minutes of detonation. The ship's engineering officer assessed that the vessel could sustain up to 22 knots without risk of patch failure. The captain set speed at 18 knots for the transit to Subic Bay. That 4-knot margin between what the patching could sustain and what the captain ordered was deliberate, because in the South China Sea at night, with a PLA Southern Theater command that had just demonstrated willingness to fire 8YJ-12BS at a U.S. cruiser, 18 knots and a 4-knot reserve, was the calculation a combat captain makes when he does not know what comes next. The crew of USS Lake Erie was not celebrating. They were working, and they kept working through the entire transit. That is the human dimension of last night that the cost asymmetry math does not capture. The crew performed. The damage control doctrine worked. And the captain's situational awareness, maintaining speed reserve, keeping combat systems online, transmitting a full SITREP before the damage control teams had even completed their initial assessment, is the reason Lake-Fire Actual is transiting to Subic Bay under its own power rather than waiting for a salvage tug. The Vampire call went out on the strike net at 47 seconds into the engagement. The cruiser's captain transmitted the standard warning: Vampire, 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 bearing and track data appended. And every ship and aircraft within radio range of Lake-Fire Actual knew what had just happened off Scarborough Shoal. On the USS George Washington, 190 miles to the east, the answer was already airborne. What the PLA Southern Theater Command did not know at minute 0 was that VAQ-138, the Yellow Jackets, the EA-18G Growler Squadron deployed with the George Washington, had been holding a 4-ship package at Alert 5 status for the past 72 hours. Alert 5 means wheels rolling within 5 minutes of the order. The order came at approximately 2 minutes after the engagement ended. The 4 Growlers were airborne before Lake-Fire Actual's damage control teams had finished assessing the hull penetration. Call signs: Screech 11, 12, 13, and 14. The EA-18G Growler is not a strike aircraft in the traditional sense. It does not carry a large bomb load. It carries jamming pods, anti-radiation missiles, and the most sophisticated airborne electronic attack suite in the U.S. Navy inventory. Its job is to find an adversary's radar and radar-guided SAM system, then blind it, deceive it, or destroy it, ideally all 3 in sequence. Screech flight crossed the Spratlys at 24,000 feet, above the engagement envelope of most shoulder-fired and short-range SAM systems the PLA has scattered across its artificial island chain. At 24,000 feet and 450 knots, the Growler is not stealthy. Every radar on Subi Reef could see them. That is partially the point. The AN/ALQ-99 jamming pods, still in service on some of the VAQ-138 aircraft, supplemented by the newer NGJ-MB next-generation jammer pods on at least 2 of the 4 Growlers on this package, create what electronic warfare operators describe as a noise environment. Think of it as trying to have a conversation while someone holds a speaker against your ear playing white noise at full volume. The signal from Subi Reef's Type 381 long-range search radar and the Type 305A SAM director is still transmitting. But the receiver trying to process the return from those transmissions cannot separate signal from noise. Track files on the 4 Growlers degrade. Intercept solutions become unreliable. The PLA operator running the Type 305A on Subi Reef last night had a choice: shut down the radar and avoid giving the Growlers a homing signal, or keep transmitting and maintain track on the inbound package. He kept transmitting. This is the tactical dilemma that SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, is designed to force. A radar that shuts down cannot guide missiles. A radar that stays on can be killed. The AGM-88G AARGM-ER. Advanced Anti-Radiation Guided Missile, Extended Range. Homes on radar emissions. Once it is fired and the seeker head locks onto a transmitting radar, shutting the radar down does not save it. The AARGM-ER has a GPS/inertial navigation backup that continues guiding the missile to the last known position of the radar even after it goes silent. The PLA figured this out years ago. The old countermeasure, shut down when you hear a harm in the air, does not work against the AARGM-ER. There is a line in the unclassified portion of the VAQ 138 mission summary that reads almost like something from a doctrine manual. Target radar maintained continuous emission through weapon impact. The Type 305A operator on Subi Reef kept his radar on all the way to the end. Put yourself in that operator's position for a second. You are sitting in a radar control van on an artificial island in the South China Sea at 11:34 p.m. local time. 4 EA-18G Growlers are inbound. Your air picture is degraded by jamming. You know, because the PLA has briefed this scenario in every electronic warfare exercise for the past 5 years, that those aircraft may be carrying anti-radiation missiles, and your standing order is to maintain air defense coverage of the island. What do? There is no good answer. That is exactly what the AARGM-ER was built to create. Before the AARGM-ER rounds left the rails of Screech 11 and 12, something was happening inside the operations center on Subi Reef that the after-action accounts from the U.S. side can only partially reconstruct, because what we know comes from signals intelligence and from the electromagnetic emissions the island was broadcasting, not from any human source inside that facility. What the signals picture shows is this. In the 7 minutes between Screech Flight's first radar contact on Subi Reef sensors and the AARGM-ER launch, the island's radar emissions underwent 2 distinct pattern changes. The Type 381 long-range search radar increased its pulse repetition frequency, a change consistent with a transition from search mode to tracking mode, confirming the operators had resolved the Growler package through the jamming and were attempting to build a fire control quality track. The Type 305A SAM director slewed approximately 14 degrees north-northeast, which is the bearing from Subi Reef to Screech 11's position at the moment of the slew. That slew indicates the fire control operator was assigning the Type 305A to a specific target, most likely the lead aircraft in the Growler package. What it means is that the HHQ-9B battery on Subi Reef was in the process of engaging Screech 11 when the AARGM-ER rounds arrived. The HHQ-9B is a capable system. Its engagement range against a non-maneuvering target at 24,000 feet is well within the geometry of the Screech Flight's approach. If the Type 305A had maintained track through the jamming environment and completed a firing solution, Screech 11 would have faced an inbound SAM at approximately the same moment its own AARGM-ER rounds were crossing the midpoint of their flight path to Subi Reef. The timeline difference between the HHQ-9B reaching launch readiness and the AARGM-ER impacting the Type 305A director was, based on the emissions timeline reconstruction, approximately 40 seconds. The same razor-thin margin that defined the SM-2 engagement off Scarborough Shoal appeared again on the opposite side of the equation over Subi Reef 26 minutes later. The pilot of Screech, the 11th of, may not have known how close that margin was. The signals picture that reconstructed it was assembled over the following hours, not in real time. What the pilot knew in the moment was that the jamming environment was degraded. The NGJ-MB pods were working, but the Type 305A had clearly achieved some track quality through the noise, and that the AARGM-ER rounds were in the air. The only thing left to do was fly the egress profile and let the weapons finish their runs. That is a specific kind of discipline. Firing your weapon and then holding course while a hostile fire control radar is tracking you and working toward a launch solution, trusting that your weapon reaches the radar before the radar reaches you, is not a decision most people can make calmly. The crew of Screech 11 made it and held their egress profile without deviation. Screech 11 and 12 launched their AARGM-ER rounds at 11:34 p.m. local time, 26 minutes after the YJ-12B volley struck off Scarborough Shoal. The AARGM-ER is a significant evolution from the original harm. Range: approximately 200 kilometers in its extended range configuration. Speed: approximately Mach 2. Guidance: passive anti-radiation homing with GPS/INS backup, and a millimeter wave terminal seeker that can acquire and home on the physical structure of a radar antenna, even if the radar has shut down. The AGM-88G variant adds a multi-mode seeker and data link capability that allows mid-course targeting updates from the launching aircraft. 2 rounds from Screech 11, 1 round from Screech 12. 3 missiles in the air simultaneously. The first AARGM-ER reached the Type 381 long-range search radar mast on Subi Reef at 11:36 p.m. The seeker distinguished between the radar antenna structure and the supporting mast using its millimeter wave terminal mode. The warhead, a 66-kilogram focused fragmentation design, detonated at optimal standoff distance. The radar mast did not collapse immediately. It bent. The antenna array sheared from its mount and fell against the equipment housing below it. The Type 381 ceased transmitting at impact -0, 3 seconds, when the antenna connection severed. It did not matter. The missile had already committed. The second AARGM-ER reached the Type 305A SAM director, the fire control radar for the H-6K surface-to-air missile battery on the island, 40 seconds later. The Type 305A is a more hardened installation than the search radar. It sits in a reinforced enclosure with blast-deflecting walls on 3 sides. The AARGM-ER's approach geometry from Screech 12 came in from the northeast, which was the open side of the enclosure. The warhead detonated inside the enclosure walls. The fragmentation pattern was contained and concentrated. The Type 305A director antenna, the transmitter unit, and the associated cooling equipment were all within the fragmentation cone. The H-6K battery on Subi Reef has radar-guided SAM coverage, past tense. The third AARGM-ER from Screech 12 targeted a secondary emitter, likely a Type 363 surface search radar on the eastern end of the island that had lit up during the Growler ingress. That emitter went silent approximately 90 seconds before the round arrived. The AARGM-ER's GPS/INS backup guided it to the last known position. The round impacted the base of the radar tower. The tower is still standing. The radar equipment housing at the base is not intact. 26 minutes and change from the YJ-12B splashes off Scarborough Shoal to the last AARGM-ER impact on Subi Reef. That timeline tells you something important about how the U.S. Navy had planned to answer exactly this kind of PLA escalation, because that response was not improvised under fire. The Growler package at Alert 5, the pre-planned targeting package for Subi Reef's radar infrastructure, the weapon selection. That was a prepared answer waiting for the question. The PLA had fired the question last night. Here is the take that will probably get us pushback. The PLA attack last night was not a miscalculation. It was a probe. A coordinated 8-missile YJ-12B salvo at a U.S. cruiser. In a scenario where the PLA had reason to believe the engagement would be close but survivable for the cruiser, gives their war planners more real-world data on Aegis engagement sequencing, SM-2 intercept geometry, and terminal defense layer timing than 10 years of simulation can. The hull fragment penetration was not an accident. It was the acceptable cost of the data collection. And the Growler response to Subi Reef was not a surprise either. The PLA expected it. They wanted to know which radars the U.S. would prioritize, which weapon system, which approach geometry. The Type 305A operator who kept his radar on until impact may have been following orders designed precisely to feed that information to PLA electronic intelligence collectors holding off to the east. If that read is correct, both sides got what they came for last night, and the next engagement will be harder for both of them. At minute 31 after the YJ-12B volley, the PLA Southern Theater Command stood up its emergency operations cell. That is the publicly known piece of what happened next. The 3 officers on the Pacific side who know the full damage assessment from USS Lake Erie are not among those briefing the press. But the 7th Fleet Liaison excerpt is specific on one point. Hull plating penetration on the after section was confirmed at multiple locations. The ship is not in danger of sinking. It is in danger of being unavailable. There is something here that most post-engagement analysis is going to miss. USS Lake Erie is one of 5 remaining Ticonderoga-class cruisers in active 7th Fleet rotation. The class is being phased out. The replacements, the DDG-X guided missile destroyer program, are years from commissioning. Every Ticonderoga that goes to a repair facility for structural work is a gap in the Aegis air defense umbrella over the carrier strike group it was assigned to protect. The George Washington now has 1 fewer cruiser in its screen. That is not theoretical. That is the current operational posture of the 7th Fleet as of this morning. Run the attrition math at scale. The PLA does not need to sink USS Lake Erie to degrade the combat power of the 7th Fleet. It needs to keep damaging ships faster than the U.S. can repair them, crew them, and return them to station. An 87.5% intercept rate against an 8-missile salvo sounds like dominance. Against a PLA that can sustain those salvos, and is willing to absorb the cost of AARGM-ER strikes on its island radar infrastructure in exchange for the engagement data. 87.5% is a number that erodes over time. The AGM-88G AARGM-ER impacts on Subi Reef tell the other half of this story. The PLA will rebuild. The Type 305A director that went offline last night will be replaced. The long-range search radar mast will be repaired or a new mast erected. The timeline for that reconstruction is weeks to months, not years. The PLA has pre-positioned construction and repair capability on the Spratlys precisely because they modeled this scenario. Subi Reef's radar coverage will be degraded for a period, and then it will return. Which means the Growler strike last night was not a permanent degradation. It was a cost imposed, a signal sent. A message delivered in the language of AARGM-ER fragmentation patterns. The message: if you fire 8 supersonic anti-ship missiles at a U.S. Navy cruiser, your radar infrastructure on the nearest artificial island will be offline before the debris field cools. Whether that message changes the PLA's calculus for the next salvo is the question nobody in Norfolk or the Pentagon is answering publicly right now. Based on everything we have shown you in this channel, the HHQ 9B deployment patterns we tracked in the video on the Spratly fortifications, the H-6K range envelopes we mapped when we broke down the Lingshui basing upgrade, there is a specific answer forming in PLA Southern Theater planning cells that does not involve backing down. Let's talk about what USS Lake Erie's engagement sequencing actually revealed to those planning cells, because this is the piece of last night that has longer legs than the fragment damage. The signals intelligence picture from last night is still being assembled, but one element of it is already being discussed at the Pacific Fleet intelligence level and is worth laying out here because it reframes the entire engagement in a way that the tactical story does not. 2 PLA Naval Intelligence Collection vessels. The designation is Type 815A, the class NATO tracks as Dongdiao, were operating in the eastern South China Sea at the time of last night's engagement. Their positions, derived from AIS data before their transponders went dark and from subsequent radar tracking, placed them approximately 280 kilometers east-northeast of Scarborough Shoal and 310 kilometers south of the George Washington's operating area. Those positions are not coincidental. A Type 815A operating at 280 kilometers from an active Aegis engagement is within range to collect the radar emissions from the SPY-1B during the engagement sequence, the SM-2 guidance uplinks during the intercept runs, and the ram seeker activation at terminal range. The PLA did not just fire 8 missiles at USS Lake Erie last night. They had 2 signals, intelligence ships positioned to record every electromagnetic emission the Aegis combat system generated during the 47-second engagement window. Every frequency the SPY-1B used for target discrimination. Every uplink the fire control system transmitted to the SM-2 rounds during mid-course guidance. The timing intervals between SM-2 launches. The RAM activation signature. The CIWE's Phalanx standby emission, which tells a careful analyst that the Phalanx was powered and ready but not needed, confirming the RAM intercept was successful before the last layer of defense had to engage. All of that data is now in a PLA electronic intelligence database. The engineers who designed the next variant of the YJ-12B, or the salvo doctrine for the next coordinated strike, will have access to it. This is what separates last night from a tactical exchange in a localized dispute. The PLA did not pay $28 million for a fragment hole in a U.S. cruiser. They paid $28 million for a complete electromagnetic signature library of the Aegis combat system under real combat stress conditions. The fragment hole was the receipt. There was a moment inside the 47-second engagement window that the after-action excerpt references obliquely, and that every Aegis combat system engineer is going to spend the next month examining. During the SM-2 engagement sequence, the Fire Control System's track correlation algorithm flagged 2 of the 8 inbound tracks as potentially the same target at slightly different engagement angles. A processing artifact caused by the compressed time-over-target spacing combined with sea surface multipath returns on the SPY-1B radar. The system held fire on one of those 2 tracks for approximately 8 seconds while the algorithm resolved the correlation. 8 seconds at Mach 2. 5 terminal approach speed is approximately 1 kilometers of inbound travel. The track correlation resolved correctly. The SM-2 was launched. The intercept was made. But that one. 8-second processing hesitation is the reason Missile 7 got close enough to require a ram engagement rather than a second SM-2 shot at longer range. The system worked. And the 8-second software hesitation is why the ram had to work too. That is not an indictment of the Aegis system. That is the margin at which modern naval air defense operates against supersonic anti-ship missiles in a coordinated multi-round salvo. The system was designed with those margins in mind. The redundant layers, SM-2, RAM, and the CIWS phalanx as a last resort, exist precisely because the engineers who built Aegis knew the margins were thin. But the PLA engineers who designed the YJ-12B's time-over-target compression in a coordinated ripple release also knew about those margins. The 8-second track correlation hesitation is in the public academic literature on phased array radar target discrimination against sea-skimming threats. The PLA has read that literature. What the Type 815A collectors recorded last night is confirmation that the 8-second hesitation is real and reproducible under combat conditions, not just a theoretical prediction in an academic paper. That confirmation is worth more to PLA missile engineers than the paper itself. It tells them the margin is real. It tells them the timing profile of a compressed salvo that forces the Aegis track correlation algorithm into exactly that hesitation is the correct doctrinal approach. And it tells them that if they increase the salvo from 8 rounds to 12, adding 4 more missiles to the simultaneous inbound picture, the track correlation algorithm will face that hesitation on more than one track pair, potentially extending the total processing delay well beyond 8 seconds. What does a 12-round salvo look like against USS Lake Erie's engagement geometry with 8 seconds of additional processing hesitation on 2 track pairs instead of 1? The math produces a different answer than last night's outcome. What is most striking about last night's engagement is not the 5% intercept rate. It is how close the engineering analysis of both sides' weapon systems brought the outcome. Both sides did exactly what their systems were designed to do. The margin between a 7 intercept outcome and a 6 intercept outcome, with 2 hits instead of 1 on USS Lake Erie, was 8 seconds of software processing time and 1 RAM round. At 11:42 p.m. local time last night, Screech flight egressed south-southwest at 24,000 feet, back across the Spratlys toward the George Washington. The jamming pods went to standby. The targeting data link closed. The 4 EA-18G Growlers of VAQ-138 had been feet dry over disputed territory, engaged the electronic warfare environment over an artificial PLA island, and put 3 AARGM-ER rounds into Subi Reef's radar infrastructure, all within 26 minutes of a Chinese bomber strike on a U.S. cruiser. Lakefire Actual was making 18 knots south-southeast toward Subic Bay under damage control protocol. The hull penetrations were sealed. The combat systems were still online. The ship's captain had already transmitted a full SITREP to 7th Fleet. The crew was not celebrating. The after-action excerpt ends with a single line that a 7th Fleet liaison passed along. It does not describe the damage. It does not describe the intercept rate. It reads, "The engagement chain compressed to 47 seconds." The doctrinal lesson is already being absorbed in Norfolk. We have spent the last week breaking down the YJ-12B kill chain, the H-6K basing upgrades at Lingshui, and the Subi Reef fortification timeline. What last night showed us is that the PLA is not building toward a capability. They are executing it. The drilled doctrine of coordinated supersonic ripple fire against U.S. surface combatants. Compressed time over target spacing designed to saturate Aegis engagement sequencing. Was not a test last night. It was a demonstration. The George Washington Strike Group has one fewer cruiser in its air defense screen this morning. Subi Reef has no functioning long-range search radar and no HHQ-9B fire control director. Both sides absorbed costs. Both sides gathered data. And somewhere in a PLA Southern Theater planning cell right now, an engineer is running the numbers on what a 12-round salvo looks like against that same Aegis engagement geometry. What does that math produce? That is the question nobody in the Pacific is comfortable answering out loud. But it is the only question that matters for what comes next in the South China Sea. Comment equation below if this changed how you think about Aegis and the cost asymmetry the PLA is running. We read every one. Subscribe to Global Warfare TV, because the next engagement in this series is already being planned, and we will show you what it looks like before it happens. The doctrinal lesson is being absorbed in Norfolk. Is it being absorbed fast enough?